Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Lair of the Crystal Fang by S. A. Sidor. Narrated by Todd Menesses. Spring, 1928. 1. The Slabs. It kills without mercy. Police discover another strangler victim. Evil lurks under Arkham. More blood down the big drain. Stanley Budzinski read the fresh headlines as he passed the newsstands on his way to work. Arriving at the job site, he chose a shovel for his day of digging. Rain trickled off his wool cap. The streets gleamed, gutters gurgling with runoff from the morning showers. The city had decided to start its controversial big drain renovation project in the Merchant District, at a hub where the sewer system and storm drains knotted together like a plate of spaghetti. Business owners weren't happy with the extra trucks clogging traffic. The road in front of the site was closed, one side of the street torn up, a giant crater gaping in the earth where before there had been a vacant lot between shops. Everything was a muddy mess, and it was only the beginning. Stanley descended a ramp into the hole where that old weedy lot used to be. He walked on planks through pools of suspicious brown water collecting outside the Main Street tunnel. Who knew what noxious flotsam and jetsam bobbed below the surface? He stepped over a low sandbag barrier, entering the open pipe mouth. The tunnels were tall enough in this part of the system that he could stay upright. Sludge spattered his boots. Each step made an obscene sucking noise like a plunger. Dreadful odors saturated the pipes. His job was dirty, brutal, and unforgiving. Stanley knew the score and accepted it because he needed the paycheck. This new lurking menace that the advertiser kept shouting about was another matter. He felt those newspaper headlines being slowly chiseled into his brain each day, and he refused to pay 2 cents to read any more nonsense about killers prowling in the pipes. That didn't mean his companions on the job didn't gobble up the lurid articles like pieces of candy. "Maybe the reporters are just making it up," he said to them while they devoured their sandwiches. "Anything to sell a few more copies, right? Who believes the garbage they print?" His fellow workers believed, that's who. Lots of other people, too. Neighbors, relatives, even his sweet wife, Lena, who toiled all day at the commercial laundry. It seemed that everyone was choosing to live in fear these days. Not Stanley. Not yet. Although he was nervous that he might be joining them soon, because the atmosphere in the sewers wasn't good anymore. Not like before. In the old days, he couldn't really explain it either, only that lately, whenever he was alone in the pipes going about his business, he'd get a queasy feeling, like he wasn't alone, like someone else was there, watching. But he always pushed the feeling away, ignoring it. How was he supposed to get his work done if he was always looking over his shoulder? The transport teams were still in the early stages of laying tracks to move men and equipment in, rubble and dirt out. For now, the only way to access the system was on foot. Stanley followed a string of electric bulbs festooned against the arching brick wall. Licorice black snaky wires supplied the juice that gave them their power, bringing light to the subterranean gloom. Looking ahead was dizzying, as if you'd tripped and fallen down a bottomless well. Sound echoes in tunnels. They're usually loud places, drills and jackhammers chewing away. But this morning, aside from his own footsteps, the pipe was silent, eerily so. He realized he hadn't seen a single worker yet. Where was everyone? Probably deeper inside, he thought, where the excavation was happening. Stanley increased his pace, convincing himself it was the humid air making him sweat so much. The papers claimed the killer lived in the pipes, or at least the creep was using the system to move around the city undetected and to dispose of a growing number of dead bodies. 3 confirmed victims to date. Same method of murder, similar patterns left behind. Each of the deceased was found floating in or around the sewers. 1 woman, 2 men. All the victims had their necks wrung. Once they were knocked out, the strangler made an incision in their throats. The fiend bled them to death. Some said the murderer must be a disgruntled doctor. The cuts might have come from a scalpel because they were precise and well-placed. The killer understood how to throttle victims without killing them, so that their blood was still pumping. No one knew the reason for stealing the blood, except the murderer. That only made the crimes worse. Because where facts failed, rumors grew, multiplying like mushrooms in the seepy dark. The newspapers didn't help, coming up with their monster of the sewers. News stories stirred the pot. People cooked up private theories about the mysterious bloodsucker. It was a mad scientist who needed fresh blood for experiments, or there was a giant South American bat that stowed away on a ship and escaped from the docks. The bat flew into the underground pipes to roost and feed. Cannibals, goblins, demons, evil spirits, witches. Hogwash. Stanley shook his head. He felt a stab of pain in his neck. That came from hard labor, not spooky campfire tales. As if there weren't enough real ways to die down here, they had to make things up for people to dread. Curse this loose talk of demons. The strangler, they said, was beastly strong, inhuman, leaving people with their skulls twisted the wrong way around. Stanley recalled an afternoon not too long ago, when a crew discovered a pale corpse floating in the muck. He hadn't seen it himself, but the work was shut down. There'd be no pay for the rest of the day. The cops marched in like invaders. The sewers were his turf, not theirs. He didn't welcome trespassers, real or imaginary. He'd heard the police were alarmed by the unusual condition of the remains. The men in blue went so far as to take down all the sewer workers' names. They made a list. They even questioned a few crewmen who'd been to jail a time or two for violent offenses, hinting the killer might be a lowly digger, someone like him. Stanley fumed at that. "I'm no criminal," he told Lena that night. "I earn my bread." He'd pounded his fist on the table. Lena had touched his arm gently. "It's wrong of them to make you feel guilty." "Every type of foulness ends up in the sewers," he said. "You can't imagine." Thinking back, Stanley felt his anger rising again. He stomped harder into the sewer ooze. Day after day, he and his cohorts made sure every awful, hideous thing that went into the pipes got whisked away, out of the city, to the river, and beyond. They kept Arkham clean. Over the years, he thought he'd pretty much seen it all. But there was one thing he'd never seen. He'd never seen a monster. "Hiya, Big Stan," a voice said suddenly. Stanley felt himself jump inside. He planted his strong legs and waited, looking ahead. It came from farther down in the tunnel. The bricks glistened with slime. Higher up, Crusted swirls clung to the walls like rancid cake frosting. Stanley froze in his tracks. His train of thoughts derailed. Hairs prickled on his arms. He wished he'd brought a safety lamp and didn't have to rely on the naked bulbs illuminating the tube. Shadows. There was room for too many shadows. Stanley squinted, ready with his shovel to strike any attacker who might rush at him. Then he sighed in relief. It was only Paddy O'Hara. The light from Paddy's safety lamp revealed the man's puffy cheeks, stretched in a jack-o'-lantern smile. Paddy, happy to see him. Good old Paddy. Paddy O'Hara was Stanley's shift boss. A demanding fella at times, but friendly enough. Stanley had worked for worse tyrants. Paddy wasn't too bad. "Morning, Paddy. Are we the only two fools who bothered showing up today?" "What? No. I sent the others for more ales." Paddy sounded distracted. His head tilted as if he were listening for something. Voices? Paddy's bloodshot eyes pinched with concentration. Stanley waited for instructions. Eventually, Paddy said, "I hope you brought your big muscles today, boyo. We've run into an unexpected delay. Major obstacle. We need to bust it out before the others get back with them rails." Paddy chewed the stem of an unlit briar pipe he'd brought all the way from Galway. He didn't light up this deep in the tunnels, not unless he wanted to risk an explosion. Fire damp and stink damp were dangerous gases that could build up, forming flammable pockets. If the methane and hydrogen sulfide didn't ignite and blow you to smithereens, they'd knock you out and smother you. A pair of real boogeymen who didn't need embellishment from the papers. A stripe of gray mud marked Paddy's jaw. He looked tired, Stanley thought. "What sort of obstacle?" he asked the shift boss. Paddy removed his pipe. He pointed the gnawed bit at Stanley. "Just you wait and see. It's a head-scratcher, this one. A real head-scratcher." His eyes showed a frantic glimmer. "Let me guess. Something not marked in the plans," Stanley said. Paddy feigned a look of shock. "In the plans?" he guffawed. "Remind me now. What are those?" "There are more unmarked tunnels down here than marked ones. I swear we'd be better off wandering in the depths, not knowing what to expect. Whoever drew these maps was having a hearty laugh at our expense. A devious joker they were." Paddy sucked airily on his pipe. Weeks ago, the Arkham City Council had finally agreed to the mayor's big drain proposal, a renovation of the deteriorating waterworks running beneath the whole town. From the start, work crews discovered the maps of the old water lines were, to put it mildly, unreliable. Paddy turned and started walking. Stanley followed him farther into the system. Above them, the residents of Rivertown were waking up. A block away, the river flowed between its ancient banks heading toward the ocean. Under the streets, a malodorous stew of hazardous chemicals and human detritus wormed along a well-worn path before emptying into the stream, then joining the Miskatonic and finally traveling east. In Rivertown, folks said the smell above ground was no better than the sewer. A miasma of fish guts and industrial waste stained the air like a sepia tint. You tasted it in your morning eggs and pancakes, in your coffee cup, or on your partner's lips. Stanley looked up at the new wood beams bracing the arch of the main tunnel. This support work was the first stage of the renovation project. Foot by foot they would inspect, repair, and widen the pipes to meet the current demands of a growing New England city. After the big drain was completed, raw sewage would be treated before pouring into the waterways. Passing from under the safety of the beams, The two men entered a section of unsecured tunnel. Evidence of damage showed everywhere. A web of cracks spread along the tube. One jagged fissure opened into a gap commodious enough to admit a curious child. Chunks of crumbling brickwork, previously located on the ceiling, checkered the floor like stepping stones. Stanley and Patty arrived at a V-split in the tunnel. To their left, a narrow side passage diverged at a 45-degree angle. Patty ducked into the smaller channel. Cut directly into the bedrock, hewn by hammers and chisels rather than bricked, it was one of many unknown antiquated drains. Many amounted to hardly more than glorified trenches, but they'd lasted, well, no one knew exactly how long they'd been there. This one's shape was oval, like a mouth opening as if to yawn, or to scream. Stanley and Patty stooped forward to fit themselves inside the low-ceilinged passage, proceeding in single file. Inside the passage, the flow of water wasn't moving forward. The calf-deep water accumulating at the bottom of the channel suddenly deepened to above the knee. A thin, rainbow-colored film coated its surface. Rough, angular rock scraped at the men's shoulders. The air grew thicker. The stink of it was more pronounced. Stanley's throat felt scratchy. His eyes were irritated, stinging and tearing up. He coughed and swallowed a mouthful of bitter spit. Stink damp. Hydrogen sulfide gas did that to a person. But he didn't feel dizzy or have a headache. Probably bad air circulation. More bad gases than normal. He'd monitor for signs of gas poisoning. His thinking was still clear. He felt fine. Then a cold, slippery hand clamped onto the back of Stanley's neck and squeezed. He whipped around, swinging his arms wildly, looking to shove it away, but there was nobody there. He rubbed the patch of bare skin below his hairline. 5 fingers had fastened themselves like a steely vice above his shirt collar. He felt the echoes of them still there. Patty stopped. "Here we go." He hadn't noticed Stanley's panic. "Take a gander at our mystery. This wee channel we're in was packed with rooks. Put here long ago they were. For what purpose? Who knows? Every gap was plugged. A crew spent the night digging them out." "We're working around the clock now?" Stanley ignored the shakes in his hands, hoping to hide any sign of alarm from his boss. But Patty was too preoccupied to notice anything. "Now till doomsday. Always behind schedule," Patty said, wiping his sweaty brow. Stanley's curiosity took over, driving away lingering feelings of fear from being touched by an invisible hand. He wanted to see what Patty had brought him here for. What was behind that plug of rocks? He leaned in, staring over the top of the shorter man. Patty raised his safety lamp to reveal the obstacle in question, and Stanley was disappointed. It looked like a cross-section of old drain. Nothing especially remarkable except for maybe its odd location. Only a portion of the exposed pipe was visible. The hand-laid stone slabs were expertly fitted together, a specimen of an earlier style of workmanship. It bisected the drain they were standing in, sealing it off, creating a dead end. That explained the bad airflow and the backed-up rainbow pool of waste that had risen nearly to the top of Stanley's thigh-high boots. "Looks old," Stanley said. "Any idea when it was built?" "Who knows? It's all gotta come out. The new tunnel is set to go right here." Stanley was going to need a pick, maybe a digging pry bar to get started. There wasn't much room to swing. He was turning to go back for his tools when Patty snagged his elbow. "Feel it first," Patty said.
What? The slabs. You gotta feel them.
Patty's expression contorted. His chin kept trembling. A misfiring nerve twitched at his left eyelid. It was as if he was fighting for control of his own face, like somebody put fishhooks in him and was pulling his features in different directions all at once. Stanley didn't like what he was seeing, as if Patty were changing right before his eyes into somebody else, a stranger. Maybe it's the shadows doing it, he thought. Maybe the cramped quarters are to blame, the gases. But that twitchy, scrambled look and his odd, sly-sounding request, one thing was for certain. Stanley hated, really, really hated, the way Patty had grabbed his elbow and hung on tight. Desperate, like a drowning man who'd lost all sense and filled up with panic, ready to drag Stanley to the bottom too.
What's it you want from me?
Stanley asked. Maybe he didn't understand. It was something simple, and he was confused, that was all. He'd give Patty another chance to explain.
Touch the slabs, Patty said. Have a good feel at them slabbies.
Pearls of sweat popped on Patty's face. Glassy, oily, unclean. He had mud in his teeth. Stanley didn't know what to do. The stones looked stable. He hesitated, thinking what could be so odd that Patty would want him to experience it too. He could think of nothing. When Patty tugged at him urgently, insistently, like a spoiled child, he ripped his arm away.
Get off me, Patty, he said. I could see it plain as day. It's only an old pipe.
An old pipe, repeated Patty. His skin had gone ashen. His lips were twin purple slugs.
Say, what's with you?
Patty swallowed, nodding as he spoke.
I came down here myself, before you did. I noticed something. A bit strange it was. Now I'm suggesting that before we bash it to pieces, you give the wall a rub for luck.
Patty seized Stanley's wrist, jerking his arm toward the blockage.
Let go, or you'll regret it.
Stanley gritted his teeth. He made a fist with his free hand. He'd hurt men with his fist, put them in the hospital. He could do worse if he had to. Patty obeyed, letting him go. He was scrappy, old Patty, but he'd be no match for Stanley in a fight. Everyone knew Big Stan's reputation. Toughest man on the job. Look at the size of those hands. A born bruiser. Patty shrank into the curve of the pipe as far away as he could get, but still he smirked at Stanley like a jolly fellow with a joke he hadn't finished telling. White spittle dotted his slug lips.
See how it feels to you, Stanley. Or are ye afraid?
Patty's voice stayed low but sharp. Stanley wasn't about to walk away from a challenge, not coming from Patty, or any living man. What did he have to worry about from old stones? He'd touch them and be done with it.
I don't know why you're so keen, Patty, but I'll have a go. Stay back.
Keeping his eyes on his boss, Stanley pressed his calloused palm flat against the slabs. They were warm, like the side of a bread oven after the fire's out at the end of a day, not exactly hot. Pleasant, really, like a cozy hearth on a winter's evening, bitter winds a-howling. Warm, like touching another person, that same amount of heat, matching and familiar. Blood warm.
Can you believe it?
Patty asked, his eyes rolling like marbles.
Crazy, right?
Stanley frowned, intrigued. He wasn't worried about Patty anymore. He pushed in closer. Using both hands, he tested the stones. They all felt about the same size, same temperature.
What's back there, do you think?
Heck if I know. Paddy tore the briar pipe out of his mouth, grinning ear to ear. Stanley couldn't figure it out. The slabs gave off a kind of gentle buzzing. He was feeling warmth inside him, too, as if he'd taken a shot of whiskey. Woozy, but good.
Maybe it's carrying hot water from somewhere, Stanley said.
From where to where? The thing runs crosswise. It's not part of the city schematics. Neither sewage nor rainwater. No steam pipes from buildings near this section. Nothing. I've no idea what it is. Maybe King Tut had a lost brother who went to Massachusetts, buried up to his eyeballs in gold trinkets and gems. Maybe it's the heat of Egypt you're feeling in there. Either way, it's moving out day, because the big drain is coming through. Let's bust in. I want to see.
I'll need a pick, Stanley said.
Here, take my light. Fetch your tools, Paddy said. Stanley was surprised.
Come back with me, Paddy. You don't want to wait here alone in the dark.
Part of him wanted Paddy to go with him, but another part wanted to leave him there. He couldn't say exactly why, but he wanted to put distance between himself and his boss. The urge to dig into the slabs felt suddenly overwhelming. The need. Break through. It's only a while, he said, Paddy's eyes watering, their whites red. Go on, before the others get back.
You sure?
Stanley asked. Paddy was scratching the fingernails of one hand into the wall behind him. He probably thought Stanley couldn't see him doing it. But Stanley could see, did see, Paddy digging away with his grubby fingers, grime under his nails like black silver moons, the raw tips bleeding. Paddy forced his lamp into Stanley's hand. Leave me, he shouted. Stanley took his safety light and went. He stepped quickly, splashing water high up the sides of the channel, giddy like a boy. Stanley only turned once to look back. By then he was climbing out of the narrow drain at the split where it joined the main tunnel. The air was better. He could breathe again. The irregular walls behind him made wavy shadows. Later he couldn't be sure what he saw. He told the police that when they questioned him. Prodded him was more like it, asking him the same questions over and over. Tell us again, what did you see down there? What did you see?
All we want is the truth, Budzinski. Tell us everything you saw.
The truth? Well, he'd only saw what he thought he saw. What more could anyone say? Stanley insisted that they had to understand that part before he would tell them more. He couldn't be sure what he saw. Did they accept that? He said they did. So Stanley told them.
Paddy was all the way inside, far back there, dancing in the dark. Arms and legs, head too, going every which way, banging into the walls, jerking up and down like a puppet on a string. Like a mad puppet on a string somebody was throwing around, only I just saw him alone. Nobody else. It was like he was in there with an invisible man attacking him. And I left him.